Hello everyone and welcome to Gyan an ICT initiative of the Institute for Excellence in Higher Education Bhopal. I am Dr. Saman Ashfaq, Assistant Professor in the Department of English, and I'm here to present or introduce the idea of post-colonial theory to all of you here. And now in this brief session, we'll be looking at the definition of post-colonial theory and examining it as a counter-discourse to colonial discourse theory. It will also look at how colonialism essentially created a schism or a divide between the East and the West and propagated the West as a superior civilization in order to drive or rather propagate the idea or the enterprise of colonialism. So in this session, we'll essentially be looking at how post-colonial theory questions the entire premise of the superiority of the Western or the European culture. So at the end of the day, the learning outcomes of this program would be, by the end, you'll be able to define the idea of post-colonialism and its theory. You'll be able to explain the strategies and processes of colonialism, essentially how colonialism is a discourse and not really something which was simply a practice of one country ruling over another. We'll be able to state the ways in which the binary opposites of the East and the West are created. So post-colonial theory essentially speaks about how the East is not really something which is defined in conjunction to the West, but rather it is a construction where the negative or rather the inferior image of the West is projected. We'll also be able to identify how the colonial or the Western ideologies are implicit in European texts about the East or the other. And at the end, the purpose of this session is to enable the learner to apply post-colonial theory to literary texts. Moving on, we all know that colonialism is a historical reality. By the year 1913, if you look at the world map of the world, you realize that almost 25% of the world's land was occupied by the British, and this was not just restricted to a part of the world, but almost all over the world. Whether it was Asia, Africa, North America, Australia, Canada, South Africa, the list of colonies, especially European colonies, goes on in the whole world. And this is one of the reasons why Britain in the 19th century was known as the age of prosperity, is simply because the wealth that was being collected or rather gathered from the colonies was fueling the greatness or rather the riches of the British Empire. Because of this, the British Empire came to be known as the empire on which the sun never sets. So coming to the idea of post-colonialism, what exactly is post-colonialism? How do we define the concept of post-colonialism or post-colonial theory? Now, simply speaking, post-colonial or post-colonialism refers to nations, peoples, writings or cultures which were once colonized by the European powers. So we can say that India is a post-colonial nation. We attained our freedom in 1947. Before that, we were a colonial nation. So if you look at the dual meanings of colonization or colonialism, it can be seen as a temporal marker, a marker of time, where you refer to a period after colonization as post-colonialism. It is also at the same time a specific reading or analytical practice. Now, when we refer to post-colonial theory, we essentially look at how post-colonial theory questions the basics or the foundations of the British Empire. It questions as to how the British Empire was not simply a civilizing mission, but at the same time, it was an exercise or an enterprise of loot and plunder, to put it very bluntly. Now, colonialism, since the very beginning, has been projected as a civilizing mission, and this was central to the idea of colonial narrative because they could not simply talk about their economic interests or business interests in the colonized lands openly. So, in order to justify the colonization of one land by another, they referred to colonialism as a civilizing mission, which was essentially meant to bring light to the darker races and regions of the world. Now, this is the foundational idea that is contained in almost all colonial narratives, and it is this idea which is questioned by the post-colonial theory. Contrary to what colonial text said, post-colonial theory says that colonialism was essentially a construction and that the construction and representation of the colonial empire was actually a textual exercise. It was not simply it did not really simply involve military control or force or rule, but rather it was a system of knowledge through which colonialism and colonial power was retained over other lands. So, and in this, as a textual exercise, it involved several kinds of systems of knowledge. For example, writings, let's say travelogues, diaries, journals, political, social, and historical tracts which were written by the colonial people. They essentially were meant to project, or rather, they were essentially meant to show to the world a certain image of the eastern land or the eastern population. So these writings played a great role in creating an image of the East versus the West. At the same time, you also find in these works reflecting the idea of the superiority of the white man. In almost all the narratives that you come across, the colonial narratives, you will see that the white man is represented as the center of civilization. He is seen as the epitome of civilization, of science, and the Western civilization is considered to be scientific in nature. And you have these ideas propagated through their text, which essentially tries to show the superiority of the white man as against the inferiority or the marginalization of the native populations or cultures. So you find the dominance of the world being placed in the Western regime, and the Eastern, or rather the colonized lands, is being seen as marginalized or inferior people. Rudyard Kipling's poem "The White Man's Burden" is a very famous example. Rudyard Kipling, he also wrote The Jungle Book, another popular work, and in this poem, "The White Man's Burden," he talks about how essentially the white man is on the path of doing a great sacrifice for these lesser mortals, for the lesser people of the other regions of the world, because he is going out to these lands, these uncivilized lands. Basically, the European culture or the European nations are sending their sons to exile to serve the needs of the colonized people, the captive people. At the same time, you also find a reference to the native people as half devil and half child. Now look at the reference of the native man. He is in complete opposition, is created in complete opposition to that of the Western man. Whereas the Western man, as I said earlier, is the symbol of civilization. You have the Eastern man, or the rather the colonized man, being represented as a half devil and a half child, which means that he neither has the rationality, or rather the intelligence to understand the world around him, and at the same time he's objectified and demonized as a half devil. So this is extremely important in understanding how representation played a great role in creating the East and the West as opposite cultures or opposite regimes. Now, looking at the post-colonial theory, examining it from the point of view of colonialism, we see post-colonial theory as a counter-discourse. The two things that it tries to do at a very basic level are, it attempts to uncover the colonialist ideologies present in European texts. As I said, as I gave the example of Rudyard Kipling's poem, post-colonialism challenges the foundational underpinnings of the empire. It questions the representation of the other. For example, how are the non-Europeans or the native populations of these colonized lands reflected or represented in their works? You see representation of the native people as black, as inferior, as somebody who's irrational, and all of these lands, be it India, for example, if you read the earlier Oriental texts, you will find references to India as a land of spirituality, as India is the land of snake charmers and sadhus and sons. Of course, we are a land of spirituality, but then that's by labeling us as a land of spirituality and just sadhus and sons, you're also essentializing or fixing that image in the minds of the world at large. So, if you see the construction of the East and the West, you will see that while the East is while the West is defined as white, it is seen as civilized, it is seen as rational, scientific, and masculine. You will see that the East bears all the attributes which are negative in proportion to the West. So you see the East is represented as black, it is barbaric, irrational, superstitious as against the scientific temper of the Western civilization, and effeminate, basically as being weak. So the East and the West are created, or rather imagined, in opposite ways. The images that are propagated are opposite to each other, and the East is always projected as the inferior other of the West. Now, this is what the post-colonial theory questions. Post-colonial theory says that the idea of colonialism was rooted in the premise of the superiority of the white regime, or the white man, or the Western civilization. But the idea is to question these representations and these, but this was just simply a strategy that the white man used in order to colonize the other, or the native population. So post-colonial theory as an analytical practice, what exactly does it do? Now it questions the writing of colonial histories, and I'll be giving an example later about this. It also looks at the role that education, the English studies, religion, the advent of Christianity, for example, in the first half of the 19th century in India, and other parts of the world, art, architecture, cartography, which is the science of map making, medicine, played in the execution of the colonial project. So here, post-colonial theory is simply projecting that this was the colonial empire was not simply constructed by force, or the idea of just manpower or military control. You had a system of knowledge such as education, architecture, art, which played a role in the construction of the colonial empire. Now, post-colonial theory also questions the impact of colonialism. Obviously, for people who have been colonized or subjected to colonialism for a long time, there is a psychological impact that they suffer from, and this impact can be observed on both the colonizer as well as the colonized. So you see that post-colonial theory looks at the impact, the psychological impact of colonialism on both the colonizer as well as the colonized. It also examines the rise of the nationalist movements. For that matter, if the colonial empire, if a nation is ruling over us, how do we as a colonized population react and respond, or rather fight or resist this colonial rule? So it looks at how it looks at small uprisings, it looks at revolts, it looks at major wars, not really wars, but at least if you look at the nation, the Indian nation, or for that part, the revolt of 1857, there were people who actually, from time to time, organized some kinds of resistance. Let's say the Go Back Simon Commission, for that matter. You have the Dandi March of Gandhiji. All of these can be seen as resistance on the part of the colonized population, as to how they tried to overthrow the colonial rule through small movements as well as bigger movements. Now this is an example of how history is being rewritten, or rather history is being questioned. And now if you look at the revolt of 1857, you'll see that in the earlier history books, the word which was used for 1857 was the revolt, or the Sepoy Mutiny, or the Mutiny of 1857. This was from the perspective of the British Empire. They looked upon 1857 as essentially a revolt or an uprising. But for us, if you look at the contemporary history books, we call it the First War of Independence. This is one example of how the post-colonial temper makes us question the representation, or rather the labels which are being given to us. Similarly, the Jallianwala Bagh incident. Now, Jallianwala Bagh tragedy was essentially a massacre, and but for a long time, and if you go through British history books, you will find Jallianwala Bagh being referred to as simply an incident or an event. Now, by labeling it as an event or an incident, it plays down, or rather, it underestimates the massive connotations of what Jallianwala Bagh is essentially represented. Because hundreds of people were massacred, and massacre should be the word which should be used, but the British Empire did not really use the word massacre. They simply labeled it as an event or an incident. So now we are rewriting history from our perspective. We are playing upon incidents, we are playing upon events which matter to us, which were earlier, I would say, erased or downplayed or marginalized from the perspective of the colonial regime, or the dominant narrative regime of that day. So this is one way of looking at it. You will really see how the empire, the British Empire. Now, the Empire Writes Back was also the name of is also the name of a very popular book by Helen Triffin and other associated writers. You find that in the colonial age, British Empire was referred to as the empire on which the sun never sets. But now, in the post-colonial age, you have somebody like Shashi Tharoor questioning the idea of the empire as a place, as a nation on which the sun never sets. In 2015, the British Parliament, he questioned the entire premise, the premise of colonialism, and said that no wonder that the sun never set on the British Empire, because even God couldn't trust the English in the dark. So he said that the British owe us an apology. The British do owe us reparations for what they've done to us. It was simply a regime of cruelty. It was a regime of suppression and subjugation and marginalization. It was nowhere a civilizing mission. The colonial empire was simply an empire constructed for the preservation of the self and the preservation of the interests of the colonizing empire. So this is essentially what post-colonial theory, in a simple way, does. Post-colonial theory, if we try to summarize what post-colonial theory does, post-colonial theory is an analytical practice which explores the colonial ideologies implicit or embedded in colonial texts about the other. The other is the native or the colonized population or the marginalized people who are reflected in these writings. It also examines colonialism as a discourse and a system of knowledge. So colonialism is not simply a military a country having a military control over another nation. It is not simply a pool of power or force, and it also explains how the colonial enterprise perpetuated the binaries of the East and the West. So the East and the West, as seen as or constructed as opposites to each other, one being the representation or the one representing the idea of growth and civilization, the other being seen as a barbaric land. As a counter discourse, it challenges the marginalization of native cultures and traces the rise of nationalist movements. You also, in this session, I also offer you a few suggested readings which would enlarge or which would make some of these ideas more clear to you. You could also look at some of the references which have been used in this presentation. There is also a small assessment test that you could attempt and try and see how much you've absorbed in this session. Thank you so much for your time and attention. Thank you. Keep learning, keep growing.